that. So one more time. Today we're going to talk about three main dictators that rose to power at the turn of the century that leads us into World War II. We're going to talk about in Russia, Joseph Stalin. In Italy, we're talking about Mussolini, rise to power. And in Germany, of course, Hitler. Then we'll talk about kind of a little bit about Nazi racism and ideology, and finally finishing Nazi aggression and getting into the war itself. So again, you might not necessarily have this in the AP exam, but you might have exams after the AP covering these times of period. I'm sure most teachers will be interested in you to learn World War II because it's a very important topic. So let's talk a little bit about totalitarian dictatorship and see the similarities between these form of dictatorship. So in general terms, we can talk about that totalitarian government risen to power in the Soviet Union, in Germany, and in Italy. We also have Japan. Japan is kind of like a different category with their dictatorship. So we'll focus more on what's going on in the European continent with the rise of dictatorship, the similarities and the differences between them. So what are the similarities? So all of these governments basically are rejecting the whole idea of liberal values, all the stuff that you guys have studied in period 6 and 7 about the rise of all parliamentary democracy, liberal values, equality, the ideas of rationality of the Enlightenment, peaceful progress, economic freedom, free economic system, and a strong middle class. They kind of reject all these values. What they're more into is more state regulation of nearly every aspect of the public life and the private behavior. They believe that the government should control all these aspects. And there's also similarities between the Soviet Union and Germany and Italy. They're all characterized by having, all of them have some sort of a form of a secret police, like Germans have the Gestapo, the Russians have the NKVD that later on turns into like the KGB that kind of spy on everyone in activities. All of these governments use propaganda to basically attack their enemy. And all of these governments have a personality cult. They're worshiping their leaders. Stalin specifically in Germany, Stalin in the Soviet Union, Hitler in Germany, and Mussolini in Italy. And also, interestingly enough, in Germany and Soviet Union, religion is kind of being eliminated. In Soviet Union, is communism, so religion is not even allowed. In Germany, they're suppressing more and more religion, so you kind of end up worshiping the leader as some form of a god. Moving on, also totalitarian dictatorship and other things, similarities between them. They are not allowing freedom of the press or free discussion. That's something that they might get attacked in the media. So a lot of them are basically slowly but surely basically eliminate all the free media, and all of them kind of control and create their own media format. Also, they eliminate all the other political parties, and it ends up that you just end up having one political party. Like in the Soviet Union, you just have the Communist Party. In Germany, you just have the Nazi Party. So elimination of all other political parties. Another similarity is use of mass surveillance. Basically, they're spying on their people, and that's something you can do comparison to today, like a country like, let's say, North Korea. North Korea today has a system where they spy on their people, so that's very, very similar. And they use some forms of terror tactics to attack the opposition, to destroy anyone that basically goes against them. So that's another form of things. Other thing is we can also look at the fact that all of them are looking into nationalism. Nationalism is one of the big isms of the 19th century that hopefully that you have studied in class. So they're using this whole idea of nationalism to basically push for their ideology. Nationalism can be things that are reflected in flags, in the language, national anthems, and so forth of that. So they use nationalism basically in hoping to mobilize the general masses and to control them. And the way to get to that, a lot of times they believed, is through conflict, violence. All of these governments believe that a conflict or a fight is actually good for them to enhance their status. Especially that refers to Hitler. Another thing also, if you want to look in political terms, if we divide, if we start splitting the communism versus Hitler and Mussolini, if we can start dividing in a political scale, we kind of can put the communism being more left-wing political parties, and we can kind of put Hitler and Mussolini as being right-wing parties. So that's another way we can divide. So there's a lot of similarities between them, but there are some differences the way they view things. One thing is the fact that under communism, they believe that everyone is equal. So that's kind of like a left-wing perspective on things. Versus in Hitler, and again, they're both extreme right-wing or extreme left-wing. So under Stalin view or communism view, people are equal. And under Hitler view, people are not equal. And there are certain races, there are higher races. So that's another differences between these groups. So let's go and just go group by group and delve into the analysis of each group. So we kind of gave a general overview. Now let's get into the details to see what are the differences between those specific groups. All right, let's get into communism. So if you watch the previous streams, you can watch the replays about the rise of socialism. So the whole idea of the Communist Party comes back from utopian socialists. And then you have people like Karl Marx, who is the father of Marxism, that talked about that one day, there's going to be an uprising of the workers and they're going to tear down the capitalist system. He talked about a revolution. So Russia experienced a violent revolution in 1917 that created a Russian form of government. Now, the person that ended up being the leader of the Soviet Union from 1924 up till his death for 1953, so we're talking about his first 30 years, who was a so brutal dictator, his name was Joseph Stalin. So let's talk a little bit about his biography. Joseph Stalin was born in Georgia. His last name is actually Janishvili, living from 1878 to 1953. So he was born in Georgia, an area that was characterized with a lot of violence, a lot of brawls. If anyone wants to read a good short biography about Joseph Stalin, I would recommend on Amazon, if you look, Paul Johnson has a very good biography, a short biography about Joseph Stalin. A short biography, you guys probably don't have time to read 700 pages. Sometimes short biographies can do the trick. He joins the Bolshevik Party, which is the original name of the Communist Party, in 1903. And he organized, it was an illegal party, of course, in Russia. He was involved in bank robberies and arms deals and assassination attempts, and he ended up in jail several times. He also had to flee Russia several times. He created the Pravda, which was the kind of like the newspaper of the Communist Party. Pravda means truth. It's kind of interesting with the communists how they come up with names that are not correct. Pravda did not report the truth, but that was the name. During that time, he was caught and sent into exile, as I mentioned several times. Now, after the revolution, after the success of the Communist Revolution in 1917 and his credential, Stalin became General Secretary of the party, a position with a lot of power because he was in charge of giving resources and appointing people. And big picture during that time from 1917 to around 1924, the leader of the Communist Party was Vladimir Lenin. And the economic situation was very, very dire in Russia. So in order to improve the economic situation, Lenin kind of made some compromises and created the NEP, the new economic policy, which kind of made Russia, from not a strictly communist country, made it kind of more into more of like a little compromise with capitalism. So he allowed certain business to operate. He allowed peasants to sell their surpluses. There was allowed some private ownerships of factories, but the state was still controlling all the banks and had most of the power. By 1922, it kind of worked and the economy was more stable. So Lenin is making some compromises to save the Russian economy that was very, very dire situation after World War I. Lenin also sets the format of Russia being a dictatorship and not allowing any other political party. He only allowed one political party, so that was the Communist Party. So the original name was the Bolshevik. Bolsheviks means majority. That's another lie. They were never the majority party. And he also moves the capital to Moscow. The original capital was in St. Petersburg. Russia is also renamed during that time, so no longer Russia, but they're known as the USSR, which stands for United Soviet Socialist Republics. For test purposes, it's USSR. Russia also becomes the first modern communist country. Interestingly enough, Marx predicted that a more economic successful capitalist country will experience the first communist revolution. He actually thought that England will become a communist country, but end up like a poor peasant country like Russia, and later on China are the actual countries that had a communist revolution. Now, in 1924, Stalin dies. There was an assassination attempt a few years before in his life. He got shot, so his health was very, very, he was in very poor health for a long time. And Stalin basically takes over Lenin very, very quickly. He's not the full-blown dictator after Lenin dies, but he starts to take many of the powers of Lenin and kind of starts the process of trying to modernize Russia very, very quickly. The only person that stands in his way is Leon Trotsky over here on the right. So Trotsky was also a very good political organizer himself, but eventually Stalin defeated Trotsky in the power grab of who's going to be the new leader, and Trotsky had to flee Russia and eventually was assassinated in 1941 by Stalin. Stalin basically assassinated most of his political opponents. And when Stalin basically took over the Communist Party, he started a whole process of cleaning up anyone that he saw as a threat. We can definitely say that Stalin, like Hitler, suffered from some sort of political paranoia, that he constantly thought that people are conspiring against them, that people are plotting against them. He always saw enemies everywhere. So there's definitely something to be said about that a lot of it's called political paranoia. Basically, people even like Richard Nixon suffered from political paranoia. They always thought that people are conspiring against them. So definitely we can say Stalin was a complete paranoid and he saw his enemies everywhere. That explains why he started to assassinate all the previous leaders from the Communist Party. Everyone that helped him end the revolution is being assassinated, and he basically creates a totalitarian government under his control. Also, he basically ends semi-capitalism that Lenin started. The NEP, new economic policy, basically is ended, and Stalin basically begins kind of a crash industrialization, also known as 5-year plans. He basically puts all of the efforts of Russia behind to make him an industrial nation. So all of Russia is basically in one big effort to move from being a peasant country to being a modern, successful economic nation. And there's a big price to pay for that process, because he basically forces farmers to leave their farms, putting them to work in factories. So millions of people die in the process of this industrialization. There's also an expansion of the party bureaucracy. We need a lot more people to run this operation. Those who resisted, and there were, of course, people who resisted, not everyone wanted to live under dictatorship, kind of can do compare and contrast to North Korea. And many of those who resisted, that's another similar thing to a lot of dictatorship, were sent into gulags That's the Russian name for like labor camps, kind of to be re-educated. So they were sent there, could be 10, 20, 30 years. Many people died in the hard work. Those who survived basically had to be brainwashed to basically believe now in the communist ideology. And even on a personal level, Stalin's first wife basically protested the things that he was talking about, and he didn't care about her idea, and she eventually committed suicide. And many of the of Stalin co-leaders are all getting eliminated very quickly. So the old Bolsheviks all are being executed. Another thing we have a lot of show trials. We have a lot of people that are claimed to be spies, but they're not. They have a show trial. A lot of them are being tortured, and in the trials they have to confess to a lot of things that they didn't do, and then they get executed. So there's estimation in the millions that around 8 million Russians were arrested during the first 10, 15 years of Stalin regime and to be put in place. And many of them went to Siberia and to gulags and to labor camps, basically to be worked to death. And definitely we can say numbers-wise that Stalin is one of the greatest mass murderers in history. So a lot of the attention is usually given to Hitler and the Holocaust, where Hitler killed 6 million Jews, and we're adding to that 5 million gypsies and so forth. So it's assuming 11 million to 20 million that Hitler was responsible for killing. But Stalin, the numbers, it might be staggering. It might be even close to 50 million people that he's responsible for their death. And Mao Zedong in China, some people estimate that that he is probably responsible for 100 million people deaths. So they're definitely, not to diminish Hitler's atrocities, but definitely Stalin and Mao do not get enough coverage in history books about the damage that they have done. Now let's talk about daily life in Soviet Union. What is daily life? Kind of, again, comparing interesting to North Korea today, that there was a lot of propaganda. The newspapers that was owned by the government and the films, they all basically kind of constantly talked about the success of the communist country and talking about communist plots. Art and literature will basically, they didn't have freedom of the press, so most of the books had to be talking about indoctrinating you to the communist ideology. They kind of rewrote history a lot of time, and religion was kind of reinvented. Basically, any art that was modern art was like seen as a horrible art. And they started to tell people how religion is fake. One of the things that Marx is famous for saying about religion, that it's opium for the masses. So you're not allowed to practice your religion. Anyone get caught in practicing religion can get arrested or even sent to the gulag. Instead of worshiping God or Jesus, now the focus is on Stalin. So everyone is worshiping. The picture of Stalin is everywhere. And most of the population is very poor. To have one room for a family was considered like a luxury from those in that time. Anyone involved in crime was severely punished, so we don't have too much crime in communism, although we have a lot of illegal operations of people smuggling things because it's very hard to get things. We have a lot of corruption, of course. We have corruption because a lot of people steal stuff because of the system, and people on the top, they're so corrupt because they're stealing from the people. So that's something that always happens if you do, again, compare North Korea today or China today, who take away from their people. All right, we have Ask a Question. Okay, so what are the similarities and difference between Stalin terror and the reign of terror of Robespierre and the French Revolution? Okay, great question. One difference is that that Robespierre, that reign of terror only lasted for 10 months, and Stalin reign of terror is lasting basically for 30 years. Another similarity or comparison, we might see Robespierre in the French Revolution is an example of the first time we basically have a reign of terror. So that's a very important, crucial point, and European history, the first time we actually mark something as being a reign of terror with mass executions and paranoia, and everyone who speaks against the government is being executed. But the context must be a little bit different because Robespierre was operating in a time when Russia was under attack from all borders, and there was some excuse. And we also had a national draft. Stalin, when he took power, the war was already over. There was no internal enemy. He was focusing to kind of recreate society. Another similarities we might say is that both of them eliminated religion. We know Robespierre and his followers basically canceled Christianity and kind of made it into a secular society. Stalin is doing a very similar thing. All right, so great question, and keep it coming in. And that's a very interesting thing. Again, even these topics are not going to be in the exam. You might want to do a compare and contrast, give some outside information is always helpful. So any question you guys have, drop in the chat box or in ask a question format. So that's pretty much about communism, and let's move and talk about fascism. So fascism is not just in Italy, as a lot of students constantly write in the exam. Fascism is also to some extent what was happening in Germany. So if we put communism as kind of being the left-wing political party, if we move to the right wing of politics, the extreme version is fascism. And that's the kind of governments that were established in Italy, Germany, and Spain. I think Spain is in the exam, so you don't need to know about them. All of them were extreme version of nationalism, and all of them basically demanded the loyalty of the people. Another thing about fascism, they all feared communism. Communism was the ultimate enemy of fascism because communism talked about equality of the people, and fascism talked about hierarchy of races or extreme nationalism and love for country. Another difference is that in fascism, they believed that people could own property. So fascism is kind of more capitalist, if you will. Hitler collaborated with capitalist business people, and that's why capitalist business people were attracted to Hitler, because they saw the other option being communism, and they felt communism will ruin business. So Hitler was pro-business, so they were like, we can do business with Hitler. Another question. All right, so both Franco and Mussolini worked hand in hand with the Catholic Church, correct? How did they do that? Yes, so interesting enough, yes. Franco and Mussolini collaborated with the church. I'm just going to go and touch on that specific point. So while Hitler was anti-religion and pushing away religion, Mussolini and Franco actually saw the legitimacy of the church. That's another like stamp of approval from their country. So we kind of have to say Germany is split between Catholics and Protestants, and Italy is mainly Catholic and Spain is mainly Catholic. So they needed the legitimacy of the Pope, and getting an agreement with the Pope is something that was very, very beneficial for them. And in return, the Catholic Church kind of got a stamp of approval as being like the official church of those countries. So, and again, when we talk about characteristics of fascism, there's many, many aspects you could go about. There's a whole cultural aspect, looking back at history, like fascists saying we are a continuation of the Roman Empire or stuff like that. So there are many aspects of that, but I'm running a little bit behind, so I can't go into all of that. Let's go over and talk a little bit about the leaders from each side and talking about what makes them different. All right, so first person, interesting enough, is Benito Mussolini, and this person really made a 360 change in his life. He used to be a socialist editor of a newspaper. He used to be a pacifist even. Isn't that amazing? From being a socialist or being a pacifist to moving into being a brutal dictator that is all about invading countries and getting into war. So that's a very, very interesting transformation. How did he go about this transformation? World War I. So a lot of these leaders were involved in World War I, and it kind of transformed them. Hitler was a soldier in World War I, and Mussolini was a soldier in World War I. So when World War I started, Mussolini kind of changes his viewpoint, and nationalism draws him to join the army, and he's actually expelled from the Socialist Party. And after the war, he, like many Italians, are very disappointed by the results of the war, and he basically decides to kind of form a new political party, which ends up being the Fascist Party. The image, basically, the fascist comes from like an axe symbol that used to be in the Roman Empire. So that's the thing about fascism. They look back in history, connect themselves to the Roman Empire. The term fascism, the image comes for that. So it's a political party that its ideology is revolved around Mussolini. So Mussolini is actually the influence on Hitler. Hitler will look a lot of the things that Mussolini does and basically copy and paste and make a few changes. So chronological, first Mussolini is the leader of a party, and then Hitler follows his ideology. So what he forms is called the Fascist Party, and he has a kind of like his own private army, a paramilitary organization, and they're known as the Black Shirts. That's another thing that Hitler is copying, basically having a private army. And Mussolini understands that Italy is very, very vulnerable and unstable. So he decides basically to make an attack on the unstable government in 1922. He basically takes his a small group of supporters, the Black Shirts, and they march into the capital and demand power and the surrender of the current government. And the king of Italy basically backs down to their demand and appoints Mussolini to be the prime minister of England. So that's how the first fascist government is established. And Mussolini titles himself Il Duce, which basically means as the leader. And he kind of sees himself as kind of like as this Roman Caesar Augustus, that he's kind of restoring the fame and the grandeur of the Roman Empire. And also remember, Italy is a new country. Italy is only established in 1871 that all of Italy is united together. And for example, the papacy, the Pope never acknowledged Italy as being a country, if we get back to the Pope. Now, it's interesting, the Pope was against Italian unification. He was afraid that that's going to take a lot of his papal power and take away from his state being swallowed by all of Italy. So the Pope never recognized the authority of Italy as a country. And that's exactly why in 1929, basically Mussolini negotiates a treaty with the Pope, the Lateran Accords in 1929. And that's finally the first time the Vatican and the Pope recognize Italy as an independent state. And in return, he's going to get the people to support the fascist regime. So everyone is getting something from this deal. So historically, again, one more time, the Pope never recognized Italy as a unified country or objected to it, actually even called for other countries to invade Italy, to fight against them. Now he is recognizing the fascist government, and they in return recognize and basically have relationship with the church. And that's why the Catholic Church to this day is being criticized for what they did in World War II, for collaborating with dictatorship versus, fighting for the rights of the people against the atrocities of that. So Mussolini, basically, to summarize, 1922, he does one major attack, takes the power from the government, takes advantage of the instability of Italy and the disappointment from the failure in World War I. And like all dictatorship, he is abolishing freedom of the press. Anyone who speaks against the fascist government can be arrested and sent to jail. Trade unions are abolished, strikes and all these sort of things are not allowed anymore. And schools basically are going to be now controlled by the fascist party. So there's going to be indoctrination, kind of like brainwashing into the fascist ideology. The same thing that you're going to see with Hitler. But interestingly enough, not everything is taken over by the fascists. The monarchy is a separate organization still, and the army is still independent. So that's one of the few things that were not the fascist party could not take over. Okay, so that's about Italy. So we covered Italy, we covered Italy, we covered Germany. We covered Italy, we covered the Soviet Union. So let's move to the last of the dictatorship, and that's Germany. So a little bit of a background about the rise of dictatorship in Germany. Germany, of course, lost World War One. Even though they felt like they won the war, they're very, very disappointed. The Kaiser of Germany, the leader of Germany, their kind of like monarch, ran away. And in 1919, for the first time in German history, the Weimar Republic is established. Germany, for the first time, is basically a democratic nation. So one more time, in 1919, the Kaiser of Germany flees. World War I is over. And the new form of government, the one that has to sign the Versailles Treaty, the humiliating treaty, is formed. So the new government is in a very difficult situation because they're seen as the government who lost the war. They're seen as like a weak democratic nation. So the Weimar Republic faces a lot of challenges from the get-go. They have some competent leaders like Gustav Stresemann, who's a smart leader and actually has 5 good years when the economy is doing well. But the Weimar Republic is finding itself being hated from the right and from the left. Nobody's really happy with this political party. You have the communists who want a communist revolution. There will be a communist revolution attempt in 1919 in the end of the war that will fail. And you got more right-wing extremists like nationalists or later on Hitler Party that see this democratic party as democratic, Germany being democratic nation as being very weak. So basically from 1919 to 1929, for 10 years, the Weimar Republic is facing a lot of challenges. They have economic collapse in the early 20s. The money value goes down. And everything really goes badly for them in 1929 when the stock market in New York crashes, enters America into the Great Depression, and the entire world is entering the Great Depression. And that's the background to the rise of Hitler, the fear, the discontent. This is where the extreme parties will get power in Germany. So this is Gustav Stresemann, one of the early successful leader of Germany in the 1920s, and some attempts to have some treaties between them and other countries happened during that time. So let's go over a little biography of Hitler. So we talked about Stalin biography, we talked about Mussolini. Last person to talk about is Adolf Hitler. So probably the most, vile, disgusting person that we talk about in history in the 20th century is Adolf Hitler. Interestingly enough, he was not born in Germany. He was actually born in Austria. So he was born in a place that had a lot of racism and anti-Semitism around him from a young age. So he's not inventing. A lot of that stuff already existed before. We know that he wanted to be an artist, that he was rejected from art school, and that we know that a lot of his political viewpoint and philosophy are based upon the fact that in the 19th century, Germany and France are experiencing a lot of extreme nationalism, a lot of anti-Semitism, a lot of ideas about racial superiority. Things like social Darwinism theories are really making heads during that time. We know when basically that this guy's almost a homeless guy with no prospect to do anything in his life. When World War I starts, that's his opportunity to do something. He tries to join the Austrian army. He's too thin. He's not accepted into the army. So he joins the German army. He fights for the duration of the war. But when the war is over, he is shocked to find that Germany has surrendered. That's a very shocking thing for him. And he joins a political party. He's not actually the founder of the Nazi party. He joins a political party, the Germans Workers' Party, and that's going to end up being the Nazi party. And he found out that very quickly that he's a very good public speaker, so he ends up being the leader of the Nazi party. So in the end of World War I, Hitler enters what will become eventually the National Socialist Party, basically not just known as the Nazi Party. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to drop in the ask a question section or in the chat box. So Hitler basically had a vision of unifying all the German nations. In case you guys studied Bismarck, you probably studied about Großdeutschland or Klein Deutschland, the different viewpoint to unite Germany and Austria or to unify all the German nations. So he had a vision of uniting all the German-speaking people into one superpower, the Austrians, the Germans, and he believed that they should be like the Rhineland, that they should control other nations. He also believed that the Germans are Aryans, that their race, that they're a master race. So he had a ideology put in place that there's a master race, and these are kind of like blonde and blue-eyed people. There are Austrians, Germans, Anglo-Saxon, that they're a master race, and below them he believed that they're like Latin races, anyone who speaks the Latin language. So they're kind of servants to the master race. And then there's a third hierarchy, and that's kind of like Slavic people, like Russian people, Polish people, and they should be the slaves of the master race. And finally, in the bottom of the ideology, there were certain races that should be eliminated, such as Jews, gypsies, or black people. So that's basically the ideology that he put enslaved, that he believed that that he wants to purify the world from all these horrible races, all the non-white races, Jewish races, and so forth. And he wanted the Germans to expand to many more territories, which he called them in German Lebensraum, which translate into living space. And again, he always tried to convince people for this racial ideology, playing on people's fears, that democracy is weak, that it's controlled by the Jews, that communism is bad. All of these sort of things he tried to either blame it on communism or blame it on the Jews. And he also constantly bringing nationalism, spoke that he's going to bring Germany to the good old days when Germany was like one of the most powerful nations in Europe. Now, it's interesting that if we do a compare and contrast between him and Mussolini, definitely Hitler was influenced by Mussolini and followed a lot of the leads of Mussolini. In the early 20s, as we mentioned, he establishes the Nazi Party. And like Mussolini, he creates what is called as the SA, which is the stormtroops. Kind of like so Mussolini had the black shirt, he has the stormtroops, or if you just want to remember as SA. He sees the success of Mussolini in 1922, how Mussolini marched and basically took power by force. So he decides, I'm actually going to do exactly the same thing. I'm going to march on the government and demand and take power from the government by violence. So that's the original plan that he has. In 1923, he's attempting what is called as the beer hall putsch. Putsch is German for like kind of like a coup d'etat. And he stages an uprising in Munich. But that uprising is crushed very, very quickly, and he's sentenced to 5 years in jail. During the trial, by the way, it's a great propaganda platform for him. He speaks about how Germany is controlled by, by the Jews, communism, all the classic things that he's blaming. And even though he's physically with weapons trying to attack the government, I mean, that's basically treason, something like that. You think he would get like a death sentence or life imprisonment. He actually gets only 5 years in prison, and he actually ends up getting only 1 year in jail. It seems like the leaders, the judges at least, kind of actually sympathized with what he stood for. So they were not really angry with him with what he claimed during the trial. So it's a great platform for him for propaganda. Now, during his time in jail, he writes his famous book, which is called Mein Kampf, which translates to My Struggle. In it, basically, it's kind of like a mishmash between a little autobiography, a little bit about himself, but it's mainly about the Nazi ideology. And again, nobody took attention to that book when it was published, only after the war when they saw what happened in the Holocaust and the killing of the Jews. and the death camp, that he actually wrote about that stuff way before that certain races needs to be eliminated. A lot of people did not take him seriously because they thought he was a crazy public screamer, that public speaker. But I think probably Churchill is one of the only leaders, the leader of England, that actually saw him as a real threat. So Hitler basically fails to take power in 1923, trying to do it the Mussolini version. So instead, what he decides to do is to reorganize his political party and maybe try more the democratic system to get elected and to gain power. So marching to the capital and taking power is not working for him. So he changes strategy and trying to work more in a political way. And he takes the Nazi party and he runs for local elections. But the Nazi party is never really successful in passing 3 to 4% of the votes. The event that changes everything is 1929, when they become a national party, and the Great Depression, when the economy collapses all across Europe, unemployment is very high. This is where he enters. This is where the Nazi party is starting to rise up in the political system. And in the 1930s, when unemployment is so high, the Nazi party almost control like a third of the seats in the German Reichstag, their version of parliament. There's a lot of instability in the German government. Prime ministers are constantly being fired. They can't deal with the depression. And finally, in 1932, the Nazis get most of the majority seats in the Reichstag. And this is the background where Hitler becomes the prime minister of Germany. So Hitler basically gains power in Germany and becomes prime minister in the democratic system. He tried by violence to get the power. It did not work for him. So he plays with the political system to get power. But once he gets power as prime minister of Germany, then he basically eliminates democracy. So that's kind of those things that you need to understand about democracy. Democracy is very dangerous because you can play the system to get elected and then you eliminate the system. Now, it's important also to know that business leaders supported Hitler. The reason business leaders supported Hitler is because during that time, the fear was who's going to take over. Is it going to be the Nazis or is it going to be the communists? The communists and Nazis were constantly fighting. So business leaders decided better to make a deal with Hitler because Hitler is not against capitalism. Communists are going to hurt our business. So Hitler got financial support and political support from a lot of business people. And also a lot of them thought he was not that smart. They thought that they can control him and he's going to play along with their demand. Anyway, in January 13, 1933, Hitler is appointed into Chancellor of Germany, Chancellor kind of like prime minister. And he calls for new elections in Germany. Now, the only person in that time that still might have power over Hitler is the president of Germany, and his name is Hindenburg. He was a war veteran in World War I, very highly respected, but he's in very bad shape. And it's during that time also when Hitler becomes prime minister, not long after that, that Hindenburg dies. And not long after that, also the Reichstag building is burned. So the German parliament is burned. So Hitler becomes prime minister, the German parliament is being burned, and Hitler uses that excuse, now that the parliament is being burned, to demand, I want totalitarian powers for a short amount of time, just to put everything back in place. And Parliament, under pressure and also under Nazi troops, are voting to give Hitler the power. So Hitler, again, plays the democratic system to basically take over power of Germany. He also, because the president is dying, he basically unifies the prime minister job with the president's job and basically making himself kind of like an emperor of Germany. He actually also has a nickname, and that calls the Führer, which means the leader. So you kind of see the similarities. Similar thing with Mussolini, El Duce, and now you have der Führer. So Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany in 1933. That's the big turning point. And he is now does not have ultimate power over every aspect of society, but he's slowly working on gaining more and more power into the German population. First thing to take power, as we mentioned, is the Enabling Act of 1933, kind of suspending the Constitution and kind of giving himself the dictatorial power for a certain amount of time. Later on, he's going to make it permanent. That's another way dictators operate. Now, when he gets into power, the German army is not willing to be loyal to Hitler because they're very worried that Hitler still has the SA, that he has his private army. So the German army is not willing to be loyal to Hitler so long that he has the SA as his private army. So based upon that, Hitler organizes what is called the Night of the Long Knives. And in this event, basically, Hitler SS soldiers basically are attacking all the former leaders of the SI, and they're all executed in what is known as the Night of the Long Knives. People like Ernst Röhm was the leader of the SI, almost equal in power to Hitler in that stage. All of these people are being eliminated. Also, concentration camps are being established during that time, and Jews, homosexuals, any political opponent, religious people, and so forth, any opponents of the government is taken to these concentration camps. So it seemed very, very clear from the get-go that there's going to be elimination of every opposition to that. So finally, one of the last things we want to talk about today is the racism of the Nazi Party, because that's a little bit more unique. If we mention so Stalin was not specifically targeting one ethnic group. He was just a paranoid who was killing everyone and everyone. He did not pick on a specific group. Mussolini was not also killing people based upon race. He did, though, preach racial ideology of the Italians, but he was not arresting Jews and putting Jews into death camp. That's something very, very unique for the Nazi Party, that they had a racial ideology in place and that they saw specifically the Jews as the enemies of the Aryan race, that it's like ruined the purification of the German blood, and they actually fought a war based upon this racial ideology. So that's a very unique situation. He got rid of his own Secret Service. So can you explain Hitler and the SI again? Why did he murder them with the long knives? He didn't actually, it's just called the Night of the Long Knives, and not necessarily that that he stabbed them with long knives. That was just a metaphor of the name. So one more time. Hitler, by the way, there's also going to be a replay of this in case you missed it. Hitler had a private army called the SA. When he got power, for 10 years, they enabled him to get the power. But once he got power, the regular German army was saying, we're not going to give loyalty to you so long as you own your private army. So Hitler was thinking, the SA, there's a lot of people that got me to this power position. They probably would want a lot of power in return for helping me right now. And a lot of them are also not that far in power behind me. The army is not giving me loyalty. So why not eliminate the SA? And then the army will swear allegiance to me, and plus I get rid of all these people with all their demands. Does that make sense now? So that was known as the Night of the Long Knives. It also kind of shows you that you can't really trust these dictators, guys. They're not even loyal to the people that gave them power. They're all in it for themselves. So that's a very, very suspicious thing for somebody to give you power. Now let's talk specifically about racism. If we want specific example, what they did to the Jews. I'm sure you guys studied the Holocaust and you know things about relating to that. But it wasn't a one-day thing that Hitler got power and one day he arrested all the Jews and put them into jail. It was a slow process for like 6 years, and Hitler was also kind of tasting the water to see if there's going to be reaction with the German people, if there's going to be reaction with the international community. So it starts off when he gets power in 1933. On April 1st, 1933, he does just one-day boycott of Jewish businesses. So one day everyone is not allowed to buy from Jewish stores, and a lot of people go and like paint swastika on Jewish stores and break glasses and ruin Jewish businesses for one day. And there's not too much reaction around the world. Then Hitler moves on to remove Jews from government jobs in 1933. So none of them can work in government businesses, universities, and so forth. They get removed from all those public schools. They can't teach and things like that. Then in 1935, they specifically passed the Nuremberg laws that define who is define how you define a Jewish person. Also takes away the citizenships of Jews. They're no longer citizen. Taking a lot of their properties and their job. And Jews are forced to wear a yellow stars. They're also prohibited to marry non-Jews and so forth like that. The Nazis basically from that point on, historically in Germany, if you had a von as a last name, that was one of the most important things, that you were related to a high class of German society. That was, your last name was very, very important. Now it seemed like in Germany the most important thing is that your blood is pure, that you have no Jewish ancestry. So everyone was trying to wipe away all their history to make it clear. That explains to how in the Nazi time you had people like Hitler who were really, really low background, or Himmler that used to have a chicken farm becomes like the second most powerful person in Germany. So it's not necessarily how much money you have or your historical background, is how pure is your blood. It's all about the purity of the blood and the racial superiority. That's the ideology. That's the most important thing. And finally, one night of explosion to show that the Nazis are not just preaching ideology and changing laws is called Kristallnacht. That's the night of the broken glass, when the Nazis smashed Jewish stores and attacked synagogues and imprisoned thousands of Jews and killed close to more than 100 Jews in that specific night. So that was known Kristallnacht, Night of the Broken Glass. So from 1933 to 1939, Hitler consolidates his power in Germany, eliminates the opposition, and gets the loyalty of many, many other organizations. So by 1939, he basically is the complete dictator over Germany. There's also a lot of appeasement at him that is thrown at him, and that's why nobody's basically fighting against Hitler. Spain we're not going to talk too much about that. I'm not sure. That's one of those topics that most people barely talk about. Spain has a civil war from 1936 to 1939. The leader that emerges is General Franco, and he's the winner of the war. Spain is going to be neutral in World War II, so they're not involved in World War II. There's many, many atrocities committed by Franco. By the way, I think just not long ago, in Spain decided to remove him from this fancy grave to like a more humble grave. So these things are still talked about. So when he dies in 1975, Spain for the first time becomes a democracy. So Spain is kind of a new democracy. So they have their own interesting situation. And finally, Nazi aggression leading us into World War II. So Hitler, during crucial years from 1933 when he gets power up till 1939 when the war starts, is checking European responses to his action, and they're treating him with what is known as appeasement. They're trying not to get into a conflict with him. They're using more of appeasement tactic against him. In 1936, for example, he enters the Rhineland, and France does not resist. That's the demilitarized area that was under French control. They basically allow him to come in and take that territory. In 1938, he invades Austria without firing one shot. This is known as the Anschluss, and he basically joins Austria and Germany, something that he always wanted to do. He was born in Austria. And then finally, in 1938, he grabs the Sudetenland, part of Czechoslovakia. So basically, from 36 to 38 to 39, he basically grabs all these territories without firing one shot, because it seems like most of the leaders of Europe are not interested in war. They're looking for ways to appease him. Because remember, World War I was just less than 20 years ago. Nobody in Europe wants to go to war again, except apparently Hitler. The leader that we associate the most with this appeasement is Neville Chamberlain over here, the Prime Minister of England, who is not interested in war and is willing to do a lot. And he actually signs a treaty with Hitler, the in the Berlin conference and comes back to England and says that that he achieved peace in our time. Hitler basically ignored that treaty later on, and in 1939 invades Poland, which is the beginning of World War II. So remember, think Fibeable, follow Fibeable on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. There's a link here to my book, Qigong for Beginners, if anyone is interested in doing some more Eastern practices, meditation, Tai Chi, and so forth. A little history in that book too. So let's get into Q&A if there's any question for today. So thank you for joining the stream, and I'll see you everyone next week.